Welcome back to the Brittany Hughes Show. Happy Thursday, everybody. Well, the left certainly thinks they've really got something this week after Jeffrey Goldberg, who is the virulently anti-Trump left-wing editor of the anti-Trump left-wing publication The Atlantic, published a story this week saying he had accidentally been included on a group chat on the app Signal that included Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, Vice President J.D. Vance, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, all of these guys and multiple other people, in which all of these top Trump officials were discussing the imminent bombing of the Houthis, which of course is an Islamic militant group in Yemen that is currently gunking up the works when it comes to international trade and shipping through the Red Sea. And on March 16th, we bombed the holy heck out of them, and we killed something like 50 of them or whatever. I don't know. I don't keep track. I also don't keep track of the number of cockroaches I've stepped on in my whole life. But this was a pretty big deal. And for the first time in a long time, it showed that America actually had a spine. And now we've got a president who's willing to do something about violent radical groups, essentially bending the rest of the world over a table. And of course, the left couldn't have that, right? We don't want to draw attention to how incompetent and absolutely neutered Joe Biden and his administration were for 4 years, and how much stronger America was, of course, under the first Trump administration and will likely be over the next 4 years. That's a bad look for the left, because right now they kind of look like, the three-legged puppy that's been wandering all over the house peeing on everything. And now the adults have to come in and clean up the mess that they've made. It hasn't really been a great look for Democrats lately. It took about 5 minutes after Trump got in office for them to start blaming him for the price of eggs, which of course had skyrocketed under Joe Biden. But they're now taking all of their failures over the past 4 years and trying to make it out to be the Trump administration's fault, and doing everything they can to pretend like the garbage that we've been dealing with now under the Biden administration isn't on them, when in fact it actually is. And we all know that. This is ultimate gaslighting attempts by the left. And so we bombed the Houthis, and it was a big deal, and it was a big victory, and it was a good look for Trump and, of course, Pete Hegseth and Mike Waltz. And remember, the left absolutely hates these guys, Pete Hegseth in particular. And so now all of a sudden we've got Jeffrey Goldberg coming out and with this article saying that he was accidentally included in this group chat where they were discussing the upcoming airstrikes about 2 or 3 hours before they actually happened. And this is supposedly the scandal of the century, that these high-level officials were using a third-party smartphone app to discuss the details of a military operation, which were classified. At least that's the claim here. We're going to get into that in a minute. And that all of this poses this massive security breach and is a show of total irresponsibility and mishandling of classified information by the Trump administration and the Fox News morning show host that, of course, we're supposed to believe he just plucked at random off of a couch to be our Secretary of Defense, which is not what happened. But that's the picture they want to paint. Never mind, of course. And we're supposed to completely disregard and totally forget that Joe Biden's Secretary of Defense got us a botched Afghanistan withdrawal that cost the lives of over a dozen American service members, a Gaza pier that cost hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars that cost the life of 2 American service members, put a bunch of gender-confused people in the military, and went in for surgery and got knocked out with general anesthesia and didn't even bother to tell anybody. And we're supposed to believe that he was this super qualified, totally competent guy, and that Pete Hegseth is the dud. And this story this week that Jeffrey Goldberg wrote is supposedly going to confirm that. Now, it's not lost on me, by the way, that the first truly successful military operation that we have seen in recent memory, right after Trump gets into office, all of a sudden we have this story that's meant to make all of these people look bad. So let's discuss this a little bit, and let's be intellectually honest about it. We're actually going to drill down to the facts, because I want to talk about why it was actually a bad thing, why it wasn't nearly what the left is making it out to be, and why either way, Democrats should probably take all the seats in the room and shut up about it altogether. So there have been 2 reports so far from The Atlantic about the story itself. They've published multiple other ones about, the Trump administration's response to all of this and why they're lying and why they suck and they're downplaying their reporting and all of that. But Goldberg has so far published 2 lengthy pieces regarding the conversation itself that he says he was accidentally included on, in which all of these top administration officials were discussing these war plans, okay? which I think we can all agree would never have been written had Goldberg stumbled his way into a group chat under the Biden administration. If that had happened, we'd never have known anything about it. So to remind here who we're talking about, Goldberg has a lengthy history of publishing anti-Trump content, including some of the most ridiculous and now debunked hoaxes. He peddled the Russia P-tape hoax, which was ultimately debunked and based on just the shoddiest intel that should never have seen the light of day. The Steele dossier and how absolutely ridiculous all of that ended up being. He was the one who claimed that Trump said American soldiers who died in war are suckers and losers, which has been repeatedly denied by multiple people who were present at the time. He has peddled these kinds of hoaxes, and that's by no means an exhaustive list. So this is why people were immediately skeptical of this story when it came out, because Goldberg is a known liar and a known hoax peddler when it comes to Trump in particular. That's why when this story came out, so many people were instantly very skeptical of it. It's not because conservatives are just so in the tank for Trump that they cannot admit when he or somebody close to him makes a mistake. There are certainly people like that, sure, but that's not why so many people immediately didn't believe this story on face value. And so this story breaks, and it all sort of hinges on the use of this app, Signal. Now, it would be very easy, I think, for the American public in general, the way that the leftist media would have you believe, to believe that using Signal is basically just like texting or like sending somebody a message over Facebook or Instagram. That's not what Signal is. Okay, for those of you who don't know, Signal is an app that uses end-to-end encryption software, meaning that when you send a message, it is encrypted until it is opened by the recipient, and only the intended recipient can open it. So if it's intercepted along the way, the person who intercepts it can't actually read it because it's all in code, okay? I have this app on my phone, by the way. I have for a while. Anybody can download it. I pretty much use it to communicate with my neighbors about setting up play dates for our kids in the cul-de-sac. I mean, literally, that I'm not even kidding, that we message one another on this app to let anybody know that, hey, you know, our kids are going to be out riding their bikes or playing basketball if anybody else wants to join. I will add, by the way, that I live in Northern Virginia. As many of you know, I am absolutely surrounded by employees of the federal government. It's the #1 employer in my area. I know multiple people employed in all kinds of departments and agencies for the federal government. And the neighbor who recommended this app as a way for all of us to communicate is a federal government employee. Now, they already had this app on their phone. In fact, multiple people currently in this little parents chat room that I am a part of already had this app on their phone. And guess who they work for? Now, I don't work for the federal government, obviously. I had to download this thing just so I could be part of this group communication. I didn't know it existed. It was introduced to me by federal employees who already knew how it worked because they had it on their phones. And by the way, I don't live next to the Secretary of State or anything, but I will tell you these are not necessarily low-level employees, okay? We're not talking about, the person who comes in once a month to wash the windows. Many of these people are longtime employees of the agency or the department where they work. They don't all work in classified spaces necessarily, but they're not exactly down in the basement sorting mail, if you take my meaning. Now, I don't know for sure that they that they use Signal for work purposes. We haven't discussed that explicitly. I don't know if that's why they downloaded it in the first place. I certainly don't know what their specific department or agency policy is for what they can use Signal for. I just personally find it very interesting that the American public is suddenly supposed to be up in arms over government employees using this encrypted third-party chat program that up until now a lot of people didn't even know about. And it's the same app that I have on my smartphone that I know for a fact a whole bunch of federal employees that I'm personally acquainted with conveniently already had on their phone because they're the ones who recommended it to me. All right, I just find that very convenient. That suggests to me, on at least some level, that this app is pretty standard practice for federal employees, which also seems to be confirmed by multiple reports, by the way. As a matter of fact, The Atlantic, the same place that just published this big expose, right, where Jeffrey Goldberg is the editor. In The Atlantic, there's a 2017 article that describes Signal, quote, as the gold standard of encrypted messaging and calling, and saying that at the time, it is, quote, used by staffers who work for President Trump, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, all but one of whom, by the way, are Democrats, okay? And I'm assuming, and I think it's a pretty fair assumption to make here, that staffers, all right, all the staffers for all of these people, the staffers the Atlantic is talking about, probably were not communicating about just their lunch plans here. I don't think that's what they were using this app for. I'm thinking if you're just letting your boss know that you're going to be, running 15 minutes late for work or trying to schedule some meeting, you're probably emailing or texting, right? You don't need to use an end-to-end encryption chat app to discuss anything other than stuff that you don't necessarily want other people to have access to. As a matter of fact, that's the entire point and why all of this was written about in the first place. Because these apps have raised some legal questions. So Signal and apps that are like that not only use end-to-end encryption software, but they actually have a setting where you can program messages to disappear after a certain amount of time. And the question that this raised is whether it runs afoul of the Presidential Records Act, which of course mandates that there are certain communications that have to be preserved for historical archive purposes. Well, if you have an app that uses end-to-end encryption software, and that you can program these messages to disappear into the ether after a certain amount of time, never to be accessed again, obviously this could be a problem when it comes to preserving records. And we know all of this. We know all of this because this is an app that has been used through at least 3 administrations. This is not new. It might be new to some people in the American public, but it's not new. It's not like the Trump administration just came in and hired some rando Fox News morning show host who sat down at a table and said, hey, I just downloaded this cool new app and we can use it to send funny memes and also make our war plans. Hashtag my phone is better than yours. That's not what happened here, okay? In fact, John Ratcliffe, when he was testifying before the Senate Intelligence Committee this week, said that CIA officials loaded the Signal messaging program onto his work computer for him and told him that it was permissible to use for work purposes, but the Atlantic is trying to paint a very different picture and make it seem as though the Trump administration is basically just, taping the details of all of our military operations to, Chinese lampposts and putting flyers in all the Russians' mailboxes. So there was a follow-up article published Wednesday in The Atlantic in which Goldberg wrote, quote, experts have repeatedly told us that the use of a Signal chat for such sensitive discussions poses a threat to national security. Okay, so on the one hand, you've got the CIA loading it onto their work computers because it's about as secure as you can get for an app like this, but the Atlantic is making it seem like Hegseth and Waltz were basically just discussing all of this very loudly in the open air at some DC bar. Okay, that's not what was happening here. In fact, the use of this app for discussing sensitive information appears to have been, established practice that dates all the way back to the Obama administration, and it was regularly used under Joe Biden, which of course Democrats want to pretend didn't happen, or at the very least, well, even if they were using it, nobody was discussing sensitive or especially classified information because, as we all know, the Biden administration was completely upfront and honest, never did anything sketchy, was totally transparent about absolutely everything. Right? I mean, the Huffington Post, which is as left-leaning a rag as the Atlantic, reported that former Biden officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity, of course, said the Signal was never permitted on their government phones because, of course, the media have to go hunt down some unnamed anonymous former Biden employee who, of course, I'm sure is not at all still butthurt over the 2024 election. And he's going to refute absolutely anything that the Trump administration says. So according to this unnamed official, quote, we were not allowed to have any messaging apps on our work phones, and under no circumstances were unclassified messaging apps allowed to be used for transmission of classified material. This is misdirection at its worst. Is it? Is it? Now, I don't know who this person is, of course, or what exact agency or department they worked for. That's the problem with citing anonymous sources, because you can't ever actually verify that they are who they say they are, or that they are, in a position to be speaking in an expert capacity on any subject. You can't verify that what they're saying is actually true. For all I know, some journalist just made up this quote and threw it in the article because it supported their preferred narrative. I don't know. With the state of journalism these days, that seems plausible. Stranger things have happened. That's the problem with anonymous sources, especially because there is, in fact, government guidance that was officially on the books that appears to contradict this. Yahoo News reports that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA for short, outlined in a guide for federal employees late last year that the encryption messaging platforms such as Signal actually better protected officials against foreign enemy hackers amid Chinese-linked cyber breaches. So CISA is an office under the Department of Homeland Security that's charged with ensuring cybersecurity across all levels of the federal government. And here is the actual guidance from the CISA, which, again, literally exists to make sure that federal government agencies and departments are not hacked. This was the guidance they published in December under the Biden administration. Quote, highly targeted individuals should assume that all communications between mobile devices, including government and personal devices, and internet services are at risk of interception or manipulation. While no single solution eliminates all risks, implementing these best practices significantly enhances protection of sensitive communications against government-affiliated and other malicious cyber actors. They then stated that highly targeted government officials should use, quote, end-to-end encrypted communications as part of these best practices and should download these platforms to their cell phones and computers. And they specifically cited Signal as one such app. So when this unnamed anonymous Biden employee says that they were not allowed to have this app on their work phones, that seems to run afoul of the guidance that was being given by the Department of Homeland Security and the agency that was tasked with ensuring cybersecurity. As a matter of fact, it was recommended that the Signal app in particular be used by highly targeted government officials to communicate sensitive information. Now, whether these, there were policies in place stating that no classified materials were to be sent over these communication platforms, that's a different story. And that's where you get into a bit of a sticky situation here, because clearly these platforms were being not only used, but encouraged for the sharing of sensitive or even highly sensitive materials. Something doesn't necessarily need to be classified to be something that you don't want to put out there in the general public or falling into your enemy's hands. But it seems that, the federal government, including the Department of Homeland Security, trusted this app in particular at least enough to recommend it for sending sensitive communications. So then the question then becomes whether the information that was shared in this specific chat room discussing military strikes against the Houthis actually qualified as classified material. And quite frankly, that is something for people far above my pay grade who work in this space could better answer. I will say, if you look at the texts that were actually shared, the ones that Goldberg originally said that he wasn't going to publish screenshots of, but then he did it, again, he did it anyway, because again, he wanted to get clicks on his website. The Atlantic, make no mistake, has a vested interest in slow rolling out this story and feeding details of this story because it generates revenue for them. All right. So we're working off of the information that we currently have. This is a big story for him. And so, I mean, this includes information. The screenshots that he did post includes information as to the specific times that these bombs were going to be dropped, the types of aircraft and weaponry that were going to be used, stuff that you probably say wouldn't want the Houthis necessarily to know. And I know some people might make the argument that the Houthis were probably not the type that were going to be able to crack a virtually uncrackable encryption program that has thus far been proven to be a reliable form of communication. I'm not really sure the Houthis have it in them, being, the flip-flop pirates that they are. But there are other bad actors in the world, countries with vastly more resources and capabilities who absolutely hate us, who would have no problem whatsoever, would be happy to obtain information like this and then sell it to the highest bidder. in an effort to damage the United States. So just because the Houthis can't do it doesn't mean that the Chinese and the Russians can't do it, for instance. So any information that was shared on this chat is probably not information that Hegseth or Waltz or J.D. Vance or anybody else who was on the thread would have wanted our enemies to know. That kind of goes without saying. To pretend that nothing of import was discussed here is simply false and is disingenuous. It's not like this was nothing. Let's be honest here. That being said, there were also a lot of very pertinent details that appear to have been left out of the conversation. At least the parts of the conversation that we've been given access to at this point. We're led to believe that everything that has been posted was the entirety of the conversation. We'll see if that remains to be seen. Maybe there was something I haven't seen yet that would change that, but so far, it's notable, I think, that if you look at the actual information that Hegseth was sharing, it did not include specific targets or locations. There were no names of targeted persons specifically given. At one point, Waltz referred to a high-level terrorist who was specifically targeted in these strikes and who appears to have met his maker. That person's name, though, was not revealed in this chat. So if we're going to be honest and say that there were details pertaining to a military operation that were discussed via a third-party smartphone app, that is true. This was not just nothing. They weren't being vague, at least on Hegseth's part, but there are also details that were not discussed that I think could have made it pretty difficult for somebody who wasn't in the know to really understand exactly what was about to happen. And that's an important question. If we're going to have a conversation about what information is classified and what isn't, what constitutes discussing war plans and what doesn't, and what specific details need to be included in a conversation to risk jeopardizing the effectiveness of a military operation and the safety of our military personnel, that's where you kind of get into the weeds here. But it does leave a question as to how much of a risk this conversation over Signal actually posed. That's the whole crux, right, of the argument here. Because as far as I can tell, the only reason anybody knew about this in the first place is because old Jeffrey here was accidentally tagged in because, I don't know, somebody had him as a contact in their phone and just clicked the wrong name. Based on everything that we currently know, based on current reporting, it was likely somebody on Mike Waltz's comms team who inadvertently added Goldberg to this chat. Waltz said he's not even sure how it happened yet because he didn't have Goldberg in his phone, has never even really met the guy. Again, there seems to be some dispute over whether or not that's true, whether he's maybe just forgetting that he's met him in the past, whatever. Based on reporting that I've read, there was somebody else who was supposed to be in the chat who wasn't, and he happened to have the same initials as Goldberg, and it just appears that there was a mix-up with whoever was the one setting up this chat room. No, I do find it terribly coincidental. I mean, they could have accidentally added anybody, right? They could have accidentally added, their grandma or their dog walker or, I don't know, their kid's third grade teacher or whatever, but they happened to add one of the most anti-Trump editors of one of the most anti-Trump news organizations in the entire country. Maybe that's just a coinky-dink. Awfully big one, though. And frankly, that's the only reason that we know this happened at all. It's not like some enemy of America, although in some ways I guess you could classify the Atlantic as such, but it's not like one of our foreign enemies, got a hold of this and that's when things went sideways. This likely would have been a completely protected and encrypted conversation had Goldberg, of all people, not somehow conveniently landed in it. And I think the key takeaways here, in my opinion, are actually pretty simple, all right? So at this juncture, based on the information that we currently have, which is a big question mark, by the way, that's how stories like this work. This is a profitability question for the Atlantic here. So we'll see if there are more details that we don't currently know. But based on this, I would put this whole situation in the same category that I put January 6th. And here's what I mean by that. I want to be ideologically consistent here. When people that I generally agree with politically make mistakes or do things that are objectively incorrect or wrong or stupid, I want to be a person who is able and willing to call that out for what it is. January 6th, for example, was not a good day. It was not a good day. I get that people were upset about the election. I get that there were a lot of people who believed genuinely to the core of their being that the election was rigged or stolen. I believe, they felt like 4 years of finally making progress against left-wing wokeism and, terrible economic and foreign policy and border policies. 4 years of relative peace on the world stage. It was all coming to a screeching halt, and people were understandably and justifiably upset. But busting in the windows to the Capitol building and chasing police officers up the stairs and forcing your way into the House chamber was not the way to solve those problems. And I'm okay with saying that, all right? Call it what it is. Call it what it is. It was a riot. It was a riot. It wasn't a good thing. But neither was it anything close to what the left wants to pretend that it was and what they are still trying to market it as a way to get political clout and to score points, okay? It was not the day that America almost came falling down around our ears. It was not an insurrection. We were not on the brink of losing our country. As a matter of fact, if you think the United States is that fragile, that the entire structure would come crashing down because a relative few yahoos busted in some windows and plopped down at Nancy Pelosi's desk, I feel kind of bad for you, because the nation that you live in your head must be made out of tissue paper. All right? That's not what it was. We did not almost lose our country that day. It was a riot. And quite frankly, it didn't even come marginally close to the length or the severity or the amount of financial damage that the Black Lives Matter riots caused in the summer of 2020. Not even close. It was a riot, and a fairly minor one at that in terms of actual damage done, compared to left-wing riots that we've seen. So I have no problem calling it what it was, as long as we put it into perspective and keep a firm grasp on reality. I don't know who needs to hear this today, but not everything has to be a 0 or a 10 based on whether your guy or the other guy did it, all right? There are some things where it's okay to stand in the middle. That's not always a bad thing. And that's the same category that I put Signalgate into here. Was it a good thing? No. Was it majorly embarrassing? Oh yeah, absolutely. We shouldn't have a repeat. And if laws and policies were knowingly broken, then there should be accountability, all right? And all of that is for people who deal with these things to take care of. We have inspectors general. We have a president, by the way, who serves as all of these people's boss. Some of this is on Trump to decide. And I think that should absolutely happen. If there needs to be accountability, there should be. And I also think there needs to be a hard look taken at what communication channels we use to discuss very sensitive government information like military plans, and how to verify that those conversations don't accidentally end up including people like, editors of news websites. Clearly, at the very absolute least, there is much greater caution that should be taken here. Okay? And it's okay to say that. But I will tell you that this criticism is awfully rich, coming from the same people who had no problem with the fact that Hillary Clinton was discussing and storing classified information on her own private home server, sitting there in her Chappaquiddick basement. Okay? I mean, you want to talk about hackable? You want to talk about a major security breach? I mean, this was the Secretary of State here, and she was storing classified information on her home server without any of the proper protections and against federal policy. We know for a fact that there was threat monitoring software on that server that blocked at least 5 attempts by somebody who was trying to get into it. That software was installed in October of 2013. For the 3 months prior to that this thing was sitting in her home with classified information on it, there was no such software installed. So God only knows whether somebody was able to access that server or any information on it before somebody finally wised up and said, hey, maybe we should, fireproof this thing. We also know Clinton used third-party software to delete emails off of the server, so now we have absolutely no idea what was in those. I mean, this was, of course, after it had been revealed that she had the server and she was supposed to turn it over to the federal government, but before she did that, she and her team went through and deleted a bunch of emails, and she claimed that it was about her daughter's wedding and yoga and stuff like that. But rather than just deleting them, she went so far as to download third-party software called BleachBit to scrub this thing so clean that there was no way anybody could ever access this stuff, which I feel like you don't do for emails that are just about getting your daughter's wedding dress altered or whether you ordered the right flowers. Okay? That's an awful lot of effort to go through to delete emails that you say were of no consequence whatsoever. So we have no idea what was on those. And when all of this came out, Democrats either sat there like bumps on a log, or they came out screeching that all of this was a Nothingburger and she didn't do anything wrong. It was an honest mistake at best, and there was nothing to see here. There was classified information sitting on her private home server that she then scrubbed before she turned it back over to the government, and we're supposed to think that there was nothing at all to that whatsoever. And these are the same people who now want us to go absolutely apoplectic over Trump administration officials using a secure encrypted app to discuss military plans, using an app that was recommended by the Department of Homeland Security to discuss sensitive materials. Now, even if that violated policy, even if that was a terribly bad idea, I'm not going to take the hand-wringing and the pearl-clutching from people who didn't care that Hillary Clinton had classified information sitting at her home. Or the fact that every time Joe Biden backed his Corvette out of the garage of his Delaware beachside mansion, he knocked over another box of classified materials that he just forgot he had. Either security matters or it doesn't. Either classified materials matter or they don't. And I am willing to criticize the Trump administration for something that I darn well know I'd be criticizing the Biden administration for. They were sloppy at best, and that's a problem. And if policies were actually violated, there should be accountability 100%. But it seems that Democrats only care about breaches of security when it involves a president that they hate and have already decided is Hitler. That's the goal here. I don't think they give one whit about military operational security. They want this administration to fail because that's the only way they can save face after absolutely bombing the last 4 years. So look, this is not a Nothingburger, okay? To pretend like this was not a big deal at all is disingenuous. I mean, the fact that an editor of a news site managed to find his way included on a group chat discussing the details of an upcoming military operation is a major security concern. Obviously, the concern is not whether Chinese can hack, the Chinese can hack this stuff. It's whether a Trump-hating liberal accidentally gets roped into the chat and publishes it for all the world to see, which I would say is a security risk. That's not nothing. But neither is it some bombshell that proves some total dereliction of duty on the Trump administration's part or some wanton disregard for the United States military and our service members. You know what does show a wanton disregard for the U.S. military and our service members is when 13 of them die because of a hastily cobbled together Afghanistan withdrawal that left hundreds of American citizens stranded and ended up being a bloody nightmare and an international embarrassment. Because President Pudding Cup barely knew his own name at that point, and we had an administration full of weak-willed sissies who didn't know what the heck they were doing. That's a security risk. That shows a wanton disregard for the American military and the safety and security of this country. And, Democrats didn't give two craps. You know how many people lost their jobs over that? Zero. 13 Marines died and their bodies were sent home in flag-draped coffins, and now their families have to live with that for the rest of their lives. And the Biden administration screwed up, and we all know it, and we didn't get a single resignation out of that. Not one. I mean, sure, maybe the Trump administration should refrain from using this encrypted smartphone app and, military operations should not be discussed over Signal. But Biden's plan actually left people dead, and Democrats didn't seem to care much then. At least not enough to demand any accountability. So you can spare me the hand-wringing over this. Oh, it's putting American service members at risk. Well, if that's true, and if policies were broken, then there should be accountability. Two wrongs don't make a right. But the left only gives a rip about military, safety and operational security when they can use it to demonize people that they have already decided are fascists anyway. And that's ultimately the goal here. So with that, that's the Brittany Hughes Show for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you guys back here next Thursday. In the meantime, head over to the Apple Podcast Store. You can hit subscribe on the Brittany Hughes Show so you don't ever miss an episode. You should also subscribe to the Newsbusters podcast with Tim Graham on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. You definitely do not want to miss that one, especially with the other hearings that were taking place in Congress regarding NPR funding and media bias. You're definitely going to want to check out the Newsbusters podcast this week. It's absolutely fantastic. I will see you guys back here next Thursday. In the meantime, I hope you have a fantastic weekend and a blessed week ahead.
Thank you.